Good afternoon, and welcome to this keynote session, which is conceived to share a vision on how to apply intelligence and mostly solve problems that you don't know how to sort out. And I'm very pleased to welcome on stage Stu Salomon. Stu?
Well, bonjour and good afternoon. I'm very excited to talk about this topic today. In fact, I know that this is one of the last sessions that you'll all be attending, so I'll try to keep this really interesting and engaging as we go through the conversation, but hopefully many of you will take away some of the same passions that I have around this topic of applying threat intelligence in ways that you haven't conceived in the past. As I go through today's conversation, I'm going to start by framing a little bit of what my view of threat intelligence is, which is there's a myriad of different scenarios on what people call intelligence and how it works. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. Then I'll move into some of the more common applications of intelligence. And then I'm really going to stretch the paradigm a bit and go much deeper into the different concepts and ways that you can start to apply intelligence in ways that hopefully will generate significant dialogue and discussion as you think about the ways in your enterprises to be able to do the same thing. So I very much appreciate your time today, and I look forward to this conversation. Also, I'm going to spend about 25 minutes discussing this, leaving a few moments for questions at the end. So I highly encourage you to think up any questions and then bring them to us towards the end of the conversation today. So with that in mind, the very concept at Recorded Future around intelligence really started with this notion of creating a digital twin of the threat environment that's available inside of all of the bits and bytes across the internet. Imagine scenarios where anything that has some semblance of a digital footprint ultimately has the opportunity to become something of intelligence value, if only you have the opportunity to be able, at scale, to collect and use that data in a meaningful way. The second key concept to think about is that intelligence isn't just for government entities any longer. We often talk about this, that the intelligence apparatus is usually aligned to a nation-state activity to be able to create intelligence outcomes. It's highly funded, it's highly sophisticated, and highly complex. The reality is there are ways to be able to do the intelligence mission, to be able to solve for very specific enterprise-level security concerns every single day, if only you have the opportunity to do so. And the reality is this. The reality is that we all operate in the same basic environment. The things that tend to make intelligence classified from a government perspective is usually around the sources and methods that are used to be able to collect and process the intelligence, and not necessarily the creation of the intelligence concepts themselves. Anything in the signals world, anything in the physical world, they all produce data elements that ultimately can be used in some fashion. So ultimately, you have those points, and then you add another one to it, and the reality is it's an ever-connected world that we all live in, to the point where every human being interfacing with every device and every machine, touching every single connection in the world, creates some form of data, and that data in turn has some intelligence value if only you understand how to discover it and use it. So I like to look at the threat pyramid, if you will, across a couple of different spectrums of the use of intelligence. And when I think of cyber threat intelligence specifically, which is what the topic of this conversation is, I look at it from a red space perspective. Do you understand the adversaries? Do you understand where they're working, who they're congregating with, the tools, the techniques, and the procedures that they use to be able to create something that will ultimately create an impact on the blue surface, which is all of our environments that we're trying to defend to be able to allow for the availability and integrity of our networks and our data. Inside of those two concepts, the red space and the blue space, there's a myriad of data elements that are constantly created. There's a third element as well. I consider this to be the gray space. And the gray space is that middle infrastructure layer that nobody owns. The information around registration, the certificate information around network traffic analysis, the connection of different data points, all of those elements serve to ultimately enrich the intelligence picture so that you have a view of the adversary and what they're doing. You have a view on your attack surface, or the network that you're trying to defend, and then you have a view of data elements from the infrastructure in which it all works. Pulling that together creates a completely different view into the intelligence picture. Now you add to that imagery analysis. So you move beyond the technical and you start to say, what can I learn by looking at a visual image? Perhaps there's metadata associated with the image itself, how it was loaded, where it was loaded, when it was first published. Is it a unique image or is it not? Is there a state change analysis available from one image to the next of the same presumed scene? Or what is the content of the information in the image itself that you can start to derive a better understanding of what you're seeing? So that now adds a fourth element of data to the process. Now, what do you do with all this data? From my perspective, there's a way to create intelligence value that's simply looking from an outside-in view to correlate against the internal view that all of your security controls are creating day in and day out. So the telemetry data that you build is generally lacking some level of external context. So you bring the external view of the attacker across those four spaces, the red, the blue, the gray, and the imagery, to start to complete that picture from an outside-in perspective. So it starts off with this. Anytime that you talk about the broader digital world, it's always about looking for that needle in the haystack. I prefer to use a different analogy. Instead of thinking of intelligence as a way to find that needle in the haystack or that single data element that tells you about that attack that's about to happen, I look at it as instead, think of the internet as a big field, a field of unplowed hay. And what our responsibility is to go in, plow that field, and create a bunch of smaller haystacks that are easier to be able to delve into and organize in a fashion analogous to data. The ability to go in and organize massive amounts of information into logical chunks that you have a better job of prosecuting. So that ultimately we can do all the things that we want to do around warning intelligence, around understanding the adversary activities, but much more importantly, it's really about breaking down the fear, uncertainty, and doubt cycle that is so endemic in all of our environments to be able to elicit trust. And why is trust important? Trust is important for one very simple reason. Because if you don't act on the threat intelligence that you have, then you're not going to get the full value that you need to out of it. And then we run into scenarios of proving an ROI or a return on investment that's very difficult and very intangible. So I look at it this way, from an action perspective. Good threat intelligence is thought to be timely, accurate, and actionable. The action doesn't always have to be an overt action to block or to remove or to arrest somebody. Sometimes an overt action is choosing not to take action at all, because in fact you've been educated on the reality of the threat and the potential for the impact that it's going to create into your security posture. Therefore, you don't have to allocate resources. Therefore, you don't have to allocate time, or therefore you don't have to create a crisis inside of your corporation or environment. So a critical component is always that actionability scenario. The next concept is that ultimately you're trying to create context. By connecting the who, what, when, where, and how, the data elements associated with completing the intelligence picture starts to come to shape why, to create context, to be able to tell a story, to be able to convey a point that others will act upon because they trust it, they believe in it, and it compels some form of action. With that in mind, obviously, you're going to collect intelligence across a myriad of sources and it becomes this massive big data problem, as I mentioned a moment ago. But let's take a step back for a second and think about the applications of the intelligence itself. So here's a great example, completely non-cyber in nature and purposely meant to be so. Let's say you're charged with the physical security of this walled town. So you have a bunch of fundamental intelligence questions, or in this case, prioritized intelligence questions that you need answered to be able to understand a little bit more about the environment. Are there blueprints of my town that exist that are in the hands of somebody who shouldn't have access to them? Does somebody have the keys to my castle? Is somebody asking questions about how to break in? And/or are some of my property already available in the markets, meaning that somebody probably got in and grabbed it already, which means I had a breach to my security? These are all fundamental questions that you would want to answer. Well, imagine the same thing from a technical threat intelligence perspective. As you start to collect data elements to be able to complete the intelligence picture, you can look at a myriad of different sources. It could be something like a obscure Chinese blog in Mandarin language that was printed 5 years ago. It could be a Microsoft white paper that was presented yesterday in English, or it could be a discussion in a Russian language underground forum. Each one of those items contribute a data element potentially to being able to complete the intelligence picture if only you knew what to find, or excuse me, where to look, what to do with that information when you looked, and to be able to correlate it against all of these other events that, from a temporal perspective, have happened over a large period of time from very disparate sources. Ultimately, you're trying to marry together all of those different data elements to be able to complete the intelligence understanding around the attacker, the victim, the tools that are being used, and the infrastructure associated with that use. The completion of that product is very similar to the analogy of plowing that field of hay that I mentioned a moment ago to be able to make sense out of all of the chaos and all of the noise. So ultimately, I like to think of this, and most intelligence professionals will speak to it as the diamond model. And the diamond model is the framework that you could begin to organize different thoughts from an intelligence perspective to be able to group together concepts around, again, the adversary, the techniques and tools that are available to them, their infrastructure, and the impact and the victimology around what they're trying to be able to create. You take that and you extract even further down to be able to get inside of those 4 major buckets additional elements around actors and around specific tools and around specific infrastructure scenarios, so that ultimately you can construct from a link analysis perspective a full view that looks for the commonality between data elements, as well as completes the picture to be able to have a full context and understanding of what's seemingly disparate data for a seemingly complex problem that needs to be solved. At Recorded Future, that's the way that we think about this. It's taking that data element, extracting that element regardless of the source, and reconstructing it back across an ontological view from all of the other data elements that are linked together to it. Ultimately, to do what? Ultimately, to be able to do a couple of things. We talked about the notion of context or telling a story with the intelligence. The next piece is, frankly, from a technical perspective, as quickly as possible, using the intelligence for prioritization and triaging, for providing contextualization and normalization of that data to be able to enrich, say, an event log inside of a SIM environment. And all of these different scenarios can be applied to either a human consumption model or from a machine-to-machine-based connection to be able to do the core things around triaging, contextualization, and enrichment. With that in mind, the initial applications of the intelligence turns out are far more vast than what we think of day to day. So it starts with the idea that it can be used in everything from tuning your firewalls, to being able to do event correlation inside of the SIM environment, to being able to plug into your GRC platform to be able to contemplate different scenarios around the evolution of risk, all the way to a different way to think about patch management, to be able to add a certain level of unique prioritization because you understand a little bit more about the external threat and how it can be manipulated to be able to create, say, remote exploitability, which completely changes the priority in the way that you assign to it. All of these different scenarios are different nodes that the very same intelligence capabilities can be plugged into to be able to create an enriched, contextualized, and in many cases, trusted action that you could take. Now, there's a ton of different scenarios that can be used inside of this kind of purpose inside of our day-to-day security capabilities. I'm actually not going to talk about them today. What I'm going to talk about is the next evolution, even beyond the notion of an intelligence-led security function. But obviously, you see all the items behind me here on the slide that certainly list them. I think that the last one is particularly important, this notion of decision advantage. At the end of the day, that's what you're really trying to gather. So with that trust, with that confidence, you're able to make decisions, you're able to automate decisions, you're able to orchestrate decisions, always predicated on a notion of a clear understanding of the who, what, when, where, why, and how that allows for that trusted activity to occur. So with that kind of backdrop in mind, I'm actually going to propose that we're at an interesting inflection point in the evolution of the use of an intelligence-led security function. So obviously, our community has continued to expand its perspective and its purview over time, starting with notions of network operations, moving into security operations, evolving into intelligence-led. And now what I'd like to say is we're at this terrific pivot point where the next step in the natural evolution is actually to make a decision around creating fusion centers. So what do I mean by a fusion center? A fusion center is essentially a place where you have commonality of objectives, commonality of communication, commonality of data, to be able to be shared across all enterprise functions, to have a holistic view at identifying the risk and solving the risk. And this follows, frankly, a classic intelligence lifecycle, or the notion of, I have a question. If I have a question, what's the priority of that question? That becomes a prioritized intelligence requirement. If I have a prioritized intelligence requirement, do I have the availability of the data to be able to answer that prioritized question that I have? If I don't have that data, do I have the ability to get the data from somewhere, or is there no opportunity at all? So I build a sourcing plan. That sourcing plan is then about collecting all the data elements to be able to answer the question asked, which then goes back into the processing of the data itself, and then ultimately a closed-loop analysis to say, am I able to answer the question now that I put all the data that I needed into the cycle? Well, imagine the same scenario. So there's a bunch of questions, as you can see here, everything from what are my risks? Who's attacking me? How is my brand going to be impacted? Do I have the control environment in place to be able to detect and defend against a logical threat that I should expect to see? All of these questions are questions that I know every single person in the audience has asked before, but the really fascinating part about it is that it doesn't have to be inside of a security function or a CISO organization to have the exact same questions be very relevant and to be able to get answers from a myriad of different sources. The reality, in fact, is that this is something that somebody in marketing could be asking or somebody in legal could be asking as well. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about why I feel this way. So first of all, the concept of a fusion center is nothing new. In the days after 9/11, the US government, as an example, put together a construct that allowed for the combination of different intelligence functions across the whole of government to be able to have common objectives, common data elements, and a common understanding of the threat picture. That same concept can be applied inside of businesses and enterprises on a daily basis. So whether you're in business operations and you want to understand how a cyber event could create some kind of business disruption, if you're within legal and you want to understand how to be able to more effectively deal with the reputation risk associated with a particular activity or potential liabilities, if you're inside of marketing and you want to understand brand impacts, or if you're dealing with physical security and you want to understand the nexus between the physical and the logical, you're asking the very same questions that were just on the previous slide that individuals inside of an organization might be asking in a security function, but only thinking that they're the ones asking those questions. And that could lead to massive chaos. So I would offer that there are a bunch of things that we do today from a fusion perspective. Let's take ransomware as an example. From a ransomware perspective, it really starts to become a combination of security and IT coming together with legal and with communication and corporate crisis management functions to be able to have a holistic view of the potential impact and to be able to communicate with government officials, with law enforcement officials, with stakeholders, with clients about the totality of the potential impact and to be able to manage the message while at the same time you're dealing with the technical components associated with minimizing the damage and the recovery. This is a perfect fusion example that we do day in and day out. A secondary one could be around vulnerability management. From a vulnerability management perspective, as I alluded to earlier, the ability to be able to understand the true business impact alongside the actual route to be able to exploit a vulnerability allows for a more holistic conversation with a business owner to be able to compel action and prioritize specific patching and potential operational impacts. This is a logical fusion scenario that we do day in and day out in our security programs. But there are additional use cases that I would ask that you contemplate as we kind of go towards the bottom of this conversation that go completely outside of a security operations function, but are just as important from an operational risk reduction perspective. So the first one, let's think about identity. If you think about identity as an example, there's a logical intersection between the human or machine-based identity as it makes a connection or an authentication request in the first place. That activity is predicated on a couple of things: the behaviors that it represents. Are they abnormal or unusual behaviors for that particular identity as expected against a peer group of its normal activities? Is it associated with badness over time? Does it have a history of doing things that are not considered appropriate for the level of access associated with it? Is it a compromised ID? Each of those different scenarios could also go through the infrastructure that's being used and the transactional behavior that's being used, or the authentication request. When you look at that intersection between behavior, identity, and the infrastructure used for the transactional behavior, you suddenly have a fused understanding of what the potential threat is and the ability to manage that threat appropriately. The same scenario, you could look at this from a fraud perspective. Let's say from a transactional fraud specifically. Is the account that's being used something that has an abnormal behavior associated with it? Has it been compromised historically? Has it been associated with bad transactional behaviors in the past? Is the infrastructure associated with the connection that's being made one that has a history or reputation of badness? Each of these different scenarios, it turns out that the data resides in different elements across the company, and you don't necessarily know how to manage that holistically and connect the dots if not for a fusion capability, bringing together business owners, fraud scenarios, security scenarios, cybersecurity scenarios, and ultimately business loss scenarios, all into one place to be able to share data against a common objective to be able to complete the contextual picture. Another one to think about is executive protection. And executive protection in many cases takes the form that you would consider around pulling together information to be able to protect our executives as they travel, protect their devices, protect their knowledge, protect their physical being. I would offer that that's a natural fusion point already between physical security and cybersecurity, but now you go a step further and you realize it's not that the individual necessarily is being targeted. In some cases they may for reputational purposes. However, what's really being targeted is the knowledge that they have, their deal knowledge, the strategy knowledge, their availability to be able to execute a particular business plan that adversary activity is going to specifically target to be able to create some level of information knowledge. And again, now you're bringing together a number of different scenarios from across the organization who are all asking these questions, sometimes unbeknownst to each other, to be able to collaborate, share, and drive a common outcome. You could do the same thing with third-party risk. Understanding the business criticality of the elements that you do business with, their security postures, the potential impact and business disruption that could occur if they are unable to execute in the way that you have contractually obligated them to do so. That opens you up to both regulatory risk as well as operational risk. And everybody from procurement, from the contracting team, from cybersecurity, from physical security, and from business process ownership, coming together to share these concepts and ideas creates a completely different outcome in the contextualization of the threat and how to manage it. The last one that I would talk about is probably the most logical one, which is the marriage between the physical and the logical. But there's an interesting component when you start to marry physical and logical together, and I like to use the analogy around the Olympics as an example for this. It turns out that there's a location example, a time-bound example, and the full spectrum of a temporal example when you look at the Olympics. The Olympics happen over a finite period of time in a singular location, but they represent a massive amount of unique threat scenarios that are analogous to most of the things that would be time-bound and location-bound. You have tourists coming into the area and are using payment systems and point-of-sale systems, which creates all kinds of transactional fraud scenarios. You have the eyes of the world on one location, which means that antisocial or scenarios whereby a particular message is going to be espoused by an actor group that use that opportunity to be able to create a platform for their messaging or hacktivism. You have an opportunity for espionage with world leaders and business leaders all coming together in one place to be able to find out information advantage and exploit that executive protection scenario I mentioned a moment ago. And then you also happen to have the sponsorship and the activities and the reputations of the companies and the individuals who are there. So over a point in time and over a period of time, you have all of these different concepts coming together to create a massive threat landscape and threat environment, very, very much open for what I would consider to be this fusion concept that we've been talking about. Excuse me. So ultimately, all of this boils down to a singular concept, and that's decision advantage, as I mentioned a moment ago. You want to be able to work across the different spectrum of associates and knowledge bases to be able to have that common activity and common knowledge which creates decision advantage. Now, I'm going to challenge this notion at the very end of the conversation here to say, how do you consolidate different data points to be able to do that? It boils down to communication and protocols. It boils down to shared and common understanding of the manipulation of requirements and the priorities associated with them. And ultimately, it's about a deconfliction effort to be able to all focus on the singular points at the same time. And with that, that's ultimately the goal of a good threat intelligence program, and that's kind of the punchline for this conversation today, is to be able to pull everything together, to be able to look across the spectrum and answer these questions holistically. With that, I want to say thank you very much for your time and attention. I really enjoy this type of topic, and please, I've left a few moments for questions or comments. Everything's on the table. I'd love to discuss. All right, the easiest question and answer session ever.